because I'm not sure if this is controversial to say or not, but for our listeners, would you say that America is an empire? And if so, why is that?
Yeah, I mean, it's 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 not a formal empire, right? It doesn't sort of have formal colonies. But if you think about an empire as a nation that exerts, a great deal of influence beyond its borders, then I think that the US does qualify in that respect, right? It exerts tremendous cultural power, tremendous soft power, tremendous economic power, and military power as well. With military bases all over the world, projecting this really degree of military power, almost unprecedented in world history. So, um, uh, somebody might object, well, yeah, but it's not an empire like Britain was, right, with India and various other sort of formal colonies, so to speak. But the British Empire went through various iterations, and it wasn't just about formal colonialism. It also projected economic power, and there are sort of informal colonies and so on. So it's if you just sort of if you kind of judge the U.S. According to an index of other world powers, which nobody would deny were empires, then it does start to look an awful lot like an empire itself.
Hi, everyone. This is AJ Woodhams, host of the War Books podcast, where I interview today's best authors writing about war related topics. Today, I am extremely excited to have on the show Hugh Wilford for his new book, The CIA in Imperial History. Hugh Wilford is a professor of history at California State University, Long Beach, and author of 5 books, including America's Great Game and The Mighty Wurlitzer. Hugh, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thank you, AJ.
Yeah, well, thanks for joining me. I always enjoy talking about CIA intelligence type stuff. I've had a few other people who have been on the show talking about it from all sorts of different angles. But this is the first Imperial History I think we're going to get on this show. And I saw this title and it really fascinated me because I wasn't quite sure what to make of it.
Right.
So maybe I'll just start off here. Tell me a little bit. What is this book about? And talk about that title.
Sure. I'm glad to hear you found it sort of fascinating and it drew you in.
It
That was
did what
the
it was supposed to
intended
do.
effect. Yes, it did
Yeah.
indeed. Yeah. Yeah, well, I guess I've been writing about the CIA for a number of years, and I not that long ago did a lecture video series for the Great Courses, which was kind of very much a sort of a narrative history of the CIA. But it left me with some bigger questions and some bigger thoughts, which I sort of wanted to put into a book. Um, and partly also it was a question of bringing together different academic fields, intelligence history, and also the history of American foreign relations, and sort of thinking about the CIA in the framework of some of the kinds of approaches that U.S. diplomatic historians have been taking recently. And and in particular, I wanted to sort of reframe the CIA's history in this new history of the Cold War that's been coming out, which is thinks about it as a clash of empires, right? It's unprecedented in some ways in that it's Soviet communism versus American and Western democracy, and the free market, etc. But it's also a lot like earlier conflicts between great powers, and it's a lot like the so-called Great Game, the clash between Imperial Britain and Tsarist Russia that sort of featured in novels by the likes of Rudyard Kipling, Kipling's Kim, I'm thinking of in particular here. So I really just wanted to sort of locate the CIA and how it gathered intelligence and how it ran covert operations within that sort of longer imperial history, and just kind of see where that would take me, what sorts of revelations that would produce.
Well, I guess to just kind of lay some groundwork here, because I'm not sure if this is controversial to say or not, but for our listeners, would you say that America is an empire? And if so, why is that?
Yeah, it's I mean, it's it's not a formal empire, right? It doesn't sort of have formal colonies. But if you think about an empire as a nation that exerts, a great deal of influence beyond its borders, then I think that the US does qualify in that respect, right? It exerts tremendous cultural power, tremendous soft power, tremendous economic power, and military power as well. With military bases all over the world, projecting this really degree of military power, almost unprecedented in world history. So, um, uh, somebody might object, well, yeah, but it's not an empire like Britain was, right, with India and various other sort of formal colonies, so to speak. But the British Empire went through various iterations, and it wasn't just about formal colonialism. It also projected economic power, and there are sort of informal colonies and so on. So it's if you just sort of if you kind of judge the U.S. According to an index of other world powers, which nobody would deny were empires, then it does start to look an awful lot like an empire itself.
Well, talk a little bit about before we get too much into. So the majority of the book is not about. The majority of the book is about Cold War history. Although I think we get like a few paragraphs at the beginning of like what intelligence was like before World War II, before the creation of the CIA, specifically in Europe and some of the empires that you compare America to. What was espionage? What was kind of the status of intelligence gathering by the imperial powers before World War II?
Well, it was tremendously important as a sort of technique of empire. I think one of the things that imperial historians have stressed recently is often how, despite all the sort of the pomp and circumstance, all the external splendor and displays of power, often empires were actually on the ground. They were very stretched in terms of that how much control they could exert over foreign populations, and this is why intelligence was important. You needed to know what was going on. You needed to know if other great powers were muscling in on your territory, if local nationalist movements were about to stage an insurgency. It was vitally important to know what was going on the ground, and this is why, um, especially in the sort of the late 1800s, even more so in the early 20th century, the British and French in particular really put a premium on the importance of information gathering, and also secretly intervening as well, right? The CIA is an intelligence gathering organization. That's its first function, but early in the Cold War, it rapidly acquired other duties as well. Covert action duties, and the again the sort of the imperial Europeans were sort of ahead of the Americans and the CIA in this respect, doing similar things themselves.
So you were right at the beginning. Basically, the traditional narrative for American intelligence, or the need for American intelligence, is we're surrounded by an ocean on both sides. When wars come, there will be intelligence. You write during the Revolutionary War, George Washington had intelligence, and then during some of our other conflicts, there were intelligence gathering operations, but no sustained intelligence
Right.
effort. Talk a little bit about that, and talk about why that narrative might not exactly be true.
Yeah, throughout American history, the sort of pattern has been intelligence is considered important in wartime, and when America is at war during the Revolutionary War and later, obviously, World Wars One and Two, then it creates intelligence organizations to help wage those wars. But then there's also this national tradition, of course, of fear of secret government power in particular, but spies generally, but spies and espionage in particular. So people wanting to sort of build a permanent peacetime spy service have always had to face up to a tremendous amount of opposition. And it's really only sort of with the Cold War and this notion that America is at this in this permanent, protracted conflict that doesn't actually involve, direct military engagement. It's only then that support becomes, wide enough to permit the creation of an organization like the CIA.
Well, let's fast forward to post World War II, founding of the CIA. What is talk about the founding of the CIA, the types of people who worked at the CIA at its founding, and what is the connection with imperialism there?
Sure. Well, I've just talked about isolationism and anti-imperialism. I think there's another important sort of strand in American political history, which is the existence of if you can sort of compare it with European imperial powers, a sort of a group of people who wield a tremendous amount of power in American society, who were kind of like a sort of an imperial class. The Imperial Brotherhood is what one historian, Robert Dean, called them, and I use that phrase in my book. So it's think Teddy Roosevelt, right? It's kind of that sort of person, and the Rose
I think you mentioned three of his descendants all ended up working at the CIA too.
That
The Roosevelt.
that's yeah. What is it?
Yeah.
Kim or Kermit, Archie, and Cornelius all become founding generation CIA officers. I mean, it's remarkable how you can. It's quite a small kind of group and media, but it's very, it exists very clearly. A lot they attend. They're often, in terms of their work, they're Wall Street lawyers. That seems to be the kind of the archetypal occupation for people when they're not spying. This is the sort of work they do. They're members of gentlemen's clubs. They attend the same Ivy League universities going, but they even so many went to a small number of New England prep schools. Groton, in particular, in rural Massachusetts, is just that you look at the Groton yearbook, and it's almost like a sort of roll call of the CIA, right? So it's these people who come from this kind of very distinct social media, and what they have is, it seems to me, is the kind of set of imperial values. They've been Groton was established by a man called Endicott Peabody, sort of lustrous ancient New England family, and he'd been educated in Britain at a British private school, public school, as they're rather confusingly known, and Cambridge, and this is sort of around the turn of the 20th century, and he'd thoroughly absorbed the sort of values of the British imperial class. You know, patriotism, assumption that you're going to run things, but that's also kind of a form of self-sacrificing service. Right, these people think they're doing what is right for the society to which they belong. Anyway, this kind of group of people is very much the group that pushes for the formation of a civilian peacetime intelligence service after World War II, and then staffs it in the years immediately afterwards. And I think that's kind of why, it's one of the reasons I think it's useful, revealing, to think of the CIA as within the context of this longer imperial history. The fact that its founders very much have imperial values, which isn't just one qualification to that, is that there is another sort of, I think, an important strand in the CIA's kind of institutional DNA, so to speak, which perhaps hasn't been emphasized quite enough in previous histories of it, which is to say, missionaries are an important part of the CIA's early history because, if you're looking around for people with foreign experience, you might understand foreign societies and be able to gather intelligence from them. Um, Missionaries are an important group to look to because not many Americans have international experience, right? Experience of living and working overseas. Missionaries do, and a, a, a number their kid so mish kids, kids of missionaries, grandchildren, one of their later generations, they are an important element in the early CIA as well. Number William Eddy, Stephen Penrose, a number of people who had served in the Office of Strategic Services in World War II, and then were important in making the CIA a permanent organization in 1947.
But you separate out the like the missionary, the Mish kids. You separate them out a little bit from the elite class. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, there's overlap there, so Eddie, I think, had been to Princeton, but yes, basically, I think there is a difference. One of the differences being that, perhaps surprisingly, a lot of the Mish kids are anti-imperial. They living overseas, they've sort of gotten to know foreign people, and they're often, and in particular, sort of local nationalist movements, trying to secure freedom from European colonialism, and they've begun to really sympathize with those groups. So you have this kind of contradictory um, element in the early CIA's history of this kind of imperial class that's very important, but at the same time this kind of missionary tradition of anti-colonialism as well. And what one way I think of thinking about the early CIA is to see it somewhat as a sort of battle between those with kind of imperial values and those who are more inclined to say no, we should not be like an empire. We need to be different from what has gone before, and just help uplift uh, um, for people who had been colonized by the Europeans, because of course this, as we'll perhaps go on to discuss, the 19 late 1940s, 1950s. This is the era when the European empires are falling apart, the era of decolonization, and suddenly these parts of the world are sort of at play, as it were, in the great power struggle that then comes up between the US and the Soviets.
Yeah, well, let's dive right into that.
Yeah.
I'm curious. We started out talking about how America kind of took its cues from imperial espionage and how the European powers were conducting espionage. Now, World War II has occurred, and we're all living in a different world. You talk about just kind of the differences on how America is setting up its intelligence agency as opposed to how the European powers are conducting their intelligence operations and how that's changing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are important differences. European societies aren't quite as anti-imperial or isolationist as American society is. So I think Europeans are sort of more prepared to kind of turn a blind eye to what secret state services are doing. Um, it the, the British state. This is just before World War One. Invents basically MI, what we know as MI5, the domestic security service, and MI6, the foreign one, just completely secretly. I mean, there's no parliamentary discussion about this, whereas the CIA is conceived in congressional debate, right? It comes out of the National Security Act of 1947. So this is all being publicly debated. So this is an important difference, and to me, that sort of is an I make the broader argument that in fact in many ways the CIA is a lot like organizations like MI5 and MI6, but there are these important differences as well. I think the CIA is always facing kind of more scrutiny and more skepticism from American citizens than European intelligence services are. So I think that that's an important difference going forward.
So now the famously or maybe infamously, the American intelligence, the CIA, is known for the coups that it foments abroad. Um, is Are the European powers, are they operating like this too? Do they operate completely different than how the CIA is operating?
Well, again, I mean, I think that there is a difference between the sort of, the high tide of European imperialism, the age of near imperialism. There aren't the kind of the reputational costs that come with intervening openly that the US would face in the era of decolonization. That's one of the sort of big arguments I make in the book, is that the CIA becomes such an important instrument of American statecraft because the Americans can't do in the era of decolonization, right? When the empires are deeply unfashionable, right? That they can't do what the Europeans did, which was send in the gunboats. The Lord Palmerston, the arch British imperialist, famously talking about gunboat diplomacy. But having said that, the Europeans, just as I was saying earlier, right? The British aren't just formal colonialists; they're economic imperialists, cultural imperialists, etc. There are there are some links and comparisons to be drawn here as well. In that, in the the British do kind of do secret interventions. They do organize coups, much like the CIA organized the coup in 1953. The the British first entered India, the Battle of Plassey. That was basically a kind of palace coup, and they also do use coups during the Cold War as well. Indeed, the operation I just mentioned, the 1953 overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran, was a kind of co-British, American-British operation, and the French resort to coups in West Africa and so on. So I think there are also these similarities with the European imperial powers, as well as connections. Historians these days are fond of talking about trans-imperial connections, and I think you see those very clearly in the history of American intelligence as well.
When would you say the CIA was at its peak for encouraging or starting coups in all these different countries around the world? Obviously, today, it's not rampant like it was. Although
Yeah.
maybe that's a controversial statement too. It's not rampant. It's not the 1950s. It's
No,
not
it isn't. Well,
every few months we're going around trying to overthrow these governments.
yeah.
When would you say the CIA was really at its peak with
Well, as you
coups?
said it, I think it's the 50s, and sort of amongst within the CIA, that used to be called the Golden Age, the directorship of Alan Dulles, who became DCI, Director of Central Intelligence, in 1953, and he was very much, it seems to me, a sort of an imperial kind of adventurer. I mean, he Rudyard Kipling's Kim was one of his favorite books. There was a copy by his bedside when he died, and he was kind of very much of that Imperial Brotherhood class I was describing earlier, and covert action, really, he found intelligence pretty boring. Just the kind of the everyday business of collecting information, and analyzing it, and writing estimates for. He was much more into coups and whatnot. And it's really under him during the 50s that, until the failed invasion, what had meant to be a coup and then became sort of a military operation at the Bay of Pigs in Cuba in 1961. And after that was the kind of end of the Golden Age. It led to Dulles subsequently was kind of made to resign in the wake of it. Obviously, it doesn't work. I mean, I probably don't need to spell that out, right? Castro survives. And if anything, his position is actually strengthened, I think, as a result of the Bay of Pigs debacle. But even then, I mean, Kennedy was, uh, then president, obviously John Kennedy was he was personally angered by the Bay of Pigs disaster because he was embarrassed by it, but he was personally politically damaged by it. But he still constantly resorted to coups in Latin America, so much so that the British, who had sort of noticed the kind of anti-colonialism of the Americans. They would British leaders like Harold Macmillan would sort of tease the Americans about this. They'd say, "Well, it seems you've forgotten about your anti-colonialism. You're doing even more coups than we ever did." And sort of bravo, keep up. Well, actually, no. Occasionally, they thought the Americans were almost getting too carried away with it, and then Nixon. There's the another famous coup in Chile in 1973, which was somewhat the work of the CIA, just as much the work of locals in the Chilean army. But again, that was another coup. The presidents often didn't. They had personal reasons for disliking the CIA. Nixon, in particular, kind of thought they were just a bunch of sort of Ivy League snobs, and you talk about the clowns over at Langley, but this didn't stop him when it suited his purposes to sort of reaching for the covert powers of the CIA. And often that's a kind of another element of the book is often, yeah, there were in sort of imperial style adventurers like Alan Dulles, but a lot of people at the CIA actually um, were were uncomfortable with kind of what they were being asked to do, these constant interventions, and try to rein in the covert action side and strengthen the original mission of intelligence gathering and analysis. But so, a lot of, if you see it as a question of sort of apportioning blame, a lot of blame for the mission creep of the CIA from intelligence into ever more covert operations really lies at the White House's door, right? Less so Langley's.
Well, I want to go step back a little bit to the coup in Iran, which you mentioned.
Mm.
So in your book, there was some new research, some recently released documents that you were drawing on. Talk about that new research. Talk about why it's important, and talk about how that fits into your book.
Sure. So yeah, there were a bunch of CIA records declassified. Historians have been waiting for decades for this, but eventually they came out in 2017, and they didn't. No, I think people said, no, perhaps there wasn't these not quite as revelatory as we'd hoped for. But it seems to me, if you read them carefully, it does show you actually how important the likes of Alan Dulles were, and also this guy Kermit Kim Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt's grandson, who was running the CIA's Near East division during these years. How important they were in the lead up to the Iran coup actually is not just in terms of planning the operation, but also kind of effectively making US policy vis-a-vis Iran. Um, and as you read these records, you also, I think, get I had this previously from earlier research, but it is, for me, it was just the impression was strengthened that Kermit Kim Roosevelt, I keep saying that, I'll just call him Kim Roosevelt, which is basically how he was known by everybody, and I think that's another sign of the importance of sort of imperial British culture on these people, that the nickname he had throughout his life was from the Kipling story, set in India, set in the Raj, about a young boy spy. And Kim Roosevelt, there's this strong feeling about him that he is kind of living out almost a kind of Kipling-esque adventure as he goes into Iran, and basically links up with people who wanted rid of Mohammad Mossadegh, the democratically elected nationalist, anti-colonial Iranian prime minister, who had gotten into a dispute about nationalizing Iranian oil, which the British didn't want because they effectively controlled it. So um, initially, so there's this joint Anglo-American coup operation, supposed to get rid of Mossadegh, replace him with an Iranian army general, Fazlollah Zahidi, and strengthen the rule of the Shah, who is seen as pro-Western, pro-American. It goes wrong. This coup operation. It's discovered on August the 15th, but then Kermit Kim Roosevelt revives it, and and then it works on August 19th. Mossadegh is basically chased out. The Shah, who had fled abroad, is brought back home, and you have and it's regarded as this tremendous Cold War victory in Washington. You didn't have to invade it, yet now in this strategically and economically crucial nation in the Middle East, you have a pro-American leader. But of course, it, it's a short-term Cold War success. Perhaps looking now from the advantage point of the 21st century, many of its consequences seem very very negative and regrettable, right? Because it strengthens the rule of the Shah. He becomes increasingly autocratic. That creates some of the conditions for the is the missed revolution of 1979, which overthrows the Shah and produces this religiously fundamentalist, deeply anti-American government that still exists today.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
yeah. So and you see this in Kim Roosevelt's kind of career, that he's hailed as a hero. So many of these people are young. Alan Dulles wasn't. He'd been around for a number of decades, but
are these like people in their 20s or 30s?
yeah,
What?
20s and 30s. Yeah, yeah. I mean, Roosevelt has this tremendous power and is controlling the fate of nations, and he's in his mid 30s. And he really sort of trades on the success of Iran, but then as he gets older, and it doesn't start to look perhaps to be like it was such a great idea after all, and I think his reputation suffers accordingly.
I wonder, just kind of as we've been talking about various coups around the world today. Obviously, Iran is, that's a major example of how that did not work in the long term for American interests. Did most of the countries where the CIA had a coup have most of those countries by this point in time, has it worked out for America having done those operations, or have most of them pretty much worked against us?
Question. I think long term, a lot of these operations have started to look like they should not have taken place. Guatemala, creates a military dictatorship that kills a number of Guatemalan citizens, and ultimately a lot of these interventions ultimately just help destabilize regions. And that was what that they were intended to achieve in the first place from a US point of view, was stabilization, so that they wouldn't become places of communist power. It damages the US reputationally as well, right? So many people around the world just basically want to love America. I mean, what's not to love, right? Democracy, um this wonderful popular culture, which so many people find seductive. All of the US's soft power. Yet this notion that secretly, kind of almost like, they don't even, it's kind of like it's the hypocrisy, right? That secretly, actually, the US is sponsoring all of these interventions, making the CIA supposedly a secret government organization into that's one of the most kind of notorious set of initials in the whole world, right? In recent world history, this is tremendously costly to the US reputationally speaking, going forward. So I think that's one of the kind of conclusions I reach, and I don't think I'm alone in that respect. I think most people who've studied the history of the CIA, and this would include great many CIA officers, ultimately think that no, perhaps it should have stuck more to its original intelligence mission, and fewer of these sorts of covert interventions.
Well, your book is so you divide it largely into two parts, abroad and at home. So internationally and domestically, thinking from an American perspective. Um, but obviously, the CIA is, it does it's a foreign intelligence
Yeah.
service. Most of its work is related to governments outside of the country. What is there to know about thinking of the imperial history of the CIA domestically here in the U.S.? What is there to know about the CIA?
A surprising amount, right, for a secret foreign intelligence agency. It's had this kind of oversized impact on US society and culture as well. And the way I frame that is around this concept of the imperial boomerang, which is something that originally third world and European intellectuals talked about with regard to European societies, that basically empires come home. They don't just happen over there. There are various ways. And I mean, sometimes it's just the people concerned, right? Your colonial officials repatriate, then often are followed by waves of immigration from former colonies. But there are also, other effects. Sometimes surveillance and policing techniques which have been developed in the in colonies then come back and are applied to domestic populations as well.
Did that has
Um,
that occurred in the U.S.?
well, yeah,
Have these
I
types of
think it.
practices?
I think it has in with regard in the sort of Cold War history of the CIA. I mean, it's happened kind of pretty very obviously during the war on terror. So you get surveillance techniques, biometric methods of identification that were developed during the occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan have then sort of been used at home as well. Military hardware has been redeployed to police forces within the US and so on. These are all kind of recent manifestations of the imperial boomerang. I think you see it during the history of the Cold War as well, in that the um, CIA counterintelligence run by this fascinating personality. A lot of these characters are just like very. I try to hang all the kind of like the institutional history and the big themes that we're talking about from portraits of individuals. So Kim Roosevelt features a lot when talking about the CIA overseas. At home, it's this character who's interested. Many biographers previously, earlier on, James Angleton, who ran CIA counterintelligence, which is supposedly trying to stop foreign spy services from stealing American secrets. He ran it for many years during the Cold War, and his counterintelligence unit within the CIA runs surveillance operations against. The anti-war movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement during the 1960s and early 1970s. Also, the Black Panthers, various black nationalist organizations within the US. Again, this is operating under orders from the White House, but this is all being carried out by the CIA. And to some, I kind of see that almost as to some extent, I think it's possible to see the anti-Vietnam War movement as a kind of an expression, particularly kind of left-wing expression of the anti-imperial tradition within American history that I talked a bit about earlier on. And if one sees the CIA as a kind of, at least in its early years, a kind of creation of this group I call following the historian Robert Dean, I call the Imperial Brotherhood, then it's kind of, there's a sort of, it's the imperial class going on versus spying on anti-imperialists here, right? In that, so again, I think a kind of imperial framework sheds some light on what's going on domestically within the US, and there's this permanent kind of tug of war between these kind of imperial and anti-imperial tendencies, and sometimes the anti-imperialists come out on top because the CIA in the mid 70s becomes the focus of a huge amount of negative publicity, and the sorts of powers it had developed in the early Cold War, already reined in by Congress. But then it kind of comes roaring back in the 1980s under Reagan, and it's the sort of the anti-imperialists who are on the back foot. So I think all of this is kind of part of this wider history that you see in imperial societies of the so-called the imperial boomerang effect. And I could talk as well, but perhaps there's no need here about sort of how the CIA also becomes involved in domestic propaganda operations as well. I
Oh no,
think that's
please
an
talk a
oh
little bit about that.
thank you, AJ, appreciate it. Yeah, I'd rather set that one up, didn't I? So yeah, the CIA. I'd written about this earlier in a book called the Mighty Wurlitzer. The CIA runs a lot of front groups during the Cold War, so groups that apparently are just private, spontaneously formed groups of American citizens with an interest in foreign affairs, and often very very anti-communist. And in fact, the CIA is in the background, sort of secretly managing these groups and providing the funding. Most of these groups are aimed at overseas populations. They're sort of trying to win what was called the battle for hearts and minds in the Cold War. It seems to me though that a lot of these groups also have a kind of domestic facing element to them as well. They're about that you get groups called things like the American Friends of the Middle East and the American Society of African Culture, AMZAC, and these are also they're partly about trying to make the US look attractive to the inhabitants of the Middle East or Africa, and help win the Cold War sort of by soft power means, but they also are about getting American citizens interested in these faraway places. They're trying to mobilize American opinion behind the Cold War. This, of course, is something that the British had done, on a huge scale in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. But overtly, right? The British government could sponsor overtly parades and empire days and so on that were about popularizing empire with ordinary Britons. With America and this kind of this kind of covert empire that they were running during the Cold War. It's the CIA that's responsible, and the government funding is hidden. And again, I kind of see this as part of the domestic footprint of the CIA, another imperial boomerang effect.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to ask you about. So we've talked a little bit about maybe what I would say the peaks and valleys of the power of the CIA. So in the 50s, obviously very powerful. Um, in the 70s, you said maybe they were in a slump. In the 80s, they were brought back, and then obviously going beyond that, the Cold War ended, the Soviet Union collapsed, but then the War on Terror, the CIA became much more relevant again. I'm curious at this point in history, and thinking about imperial history too. What would you say? How would you classify the CIA right now in terms of these? We're talking about peaks and valleys.
Mm.
Where would the CIA fit right now?
Yeah, right. It's been quite the roller coaster ride in the last sort of 20 years of its existence, right? I mean, obviously, the CIA was blamed for the surprise of 9/11, although I think somewhat unfairly in my mind. I think the White House, George Bush administration deserves equal blame for that. But after that, and then the weapons of mass destruction sort of debacle, intelligence debacle in Iraq, the CIA's reputation was pretty much at an all-time low, which was why it was sort of effectively demoted within the sort of intelligence hierarchy, and a director of national intelligence was put over the CIA and the various other intelligence agencies, thereby, as I say, sort of demoting the power of the director of central intelligence. But then, with again, some of the sort of publicity efforts of the sort that occurred during the Cold War, and with the success, the undoubted success of operations like the hunt for Osama bin Laden, right? The CIA comes roaring back, and during the war on terror, it's really in the front line again, right? It's it's given responsibility for targeted killing, right? For drone warfare. So it's but then comes Trump and these extraordinary, I mean, not entirely unprecedented, because as I suggested earlier, Richard Nixon, there's very little love lost between Nixon and the CIA, but the level of open hostility between Trump and the intelligence community, and in particular the CIA, is utterly unprecedented. Um, so and then you get this kind of strange phenomenon, which is, people perhaps on the progressive or liberal end of the political spectrum who previously would have criticized the CIA a great deal, because it's an enemy of Trump, right? They actually start to kind of see it as a good thing. And John Brennan, the former director of CIA, during the Obama administration, who becomes a extraordinarily outspoken critic from the intelligence community of Trump. He becomes a sort of darling of the liberal media. So it's it's right. It's topsy turvy. It's currently, it's under Biden. It's a pretty friendly administration towards the intelligence community. It's kind of it's doing the sorts of um, um, missions. It's performing the sorts of missions that it's always performed. Important intelligence gathering, some covert action as well, and I think the Biden administration is happy for it to carry on doing so. Quite. Who knows what will happen after November? As with so many things, right? I'm sure we'll get another round of if Donald Trump is elected, of White House versus Langley brawls. Um, uh, 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 yeah, and clearly, Trump has a he sees a lot of enemies within what he calls, along with various conspiracy theorists, the deep state, and I don't doubt that he will go after them if he's in a position where he can do so.
Well, Hugh, this has been a wonderful interview. I've loved your answers to my questions. My last question for you here, before we wrap up, is what are you hoping that readers take away from your book?
Well, I hope they enjoy reading it. I try to make it because it's a group biography. I always find that an engaging way of writing history is by putting personalities kind of front and center. And I think human beings and emotions are a very important part of the CIA's history. It's not just a kind of dull organizational history. So I hope they'll enjoy that. I hope they'll think about the CIA in sort of a bigger historical terms, right? They'll see it as part of a broader global history. And I hope that also some of I'm not necessarily somebody who writes history to sort of to teach lessons, but nonetheless, I think there are some pretty clear lessons to take away from the history of the CIA. And I think one of them is that really, covert operations, when they succeed, and there's a long list of ones that have not succeeded even in the short term, but even the ones that do succeed in the short term often have unanticipated long-term consequences. um, the, but this, having said that, the CIA does have an important mission. All modern uh, democracies, modern states, modern democracies in particular, need an effective intelligence services, and I hope that the CIA is allowed to focus on that mission going forward.
Yeah. And Hugh, if people want to stay in touch with your work, are you on social media? How can people stay in touch with what you're doing?
Oh, I'm afraid I don't have much of a social media
Good
presence.
for you.
Uh, but although my son might, who knows? We'll see. He's getting increasingly interested in tech, so he might change that at some point in the future. But I do I do op-eds. I I am continuing to write and will publish more. So I
Great.
think just yeah, keeping an
Just
eye
do a
out
Google
for
search.
future publications. Yeah, just search. Yeah, I'm all over the internet. Kind of it's one of the it's one of the joys of writing about a subject like the CIA, but also one of the kind of the costs is that you end up with a very big internet presence.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
yeah,
it's probably best actually that you don't have your information quite so accessible out there. You
right,
might
yeah,
end
yeah.
up with
That's
some crazy notes in your
I think you got a point there, AJ. Yeah.
Well, Hugh Wilford, the CIA and Imperial History. Go buy a copy. Go check it out from your library. What a fascinating story you've gotten here, Hugh. And again, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me on. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, AJ.